Okay, so here's a question for you. When you think of Julius Caesar, what do you think of?
Conquest, power, ambition. The guy who crossed the Rubicon and basically said, democracy, I'm breaking you.
Right, everyone knows Caesar, the legend, the military genius. Shakespeare made him immortal. But here's what most people don't know. There was one man who stood between Caesar and absolute power. One man who said no when everyone else was saying yes.
And that man was?
Cato the Younger.
Cato the Younger. Now, there's a name that doesn't get the Hollywood treatment.
Not a single blockbuster, which is insane because this guy was basically the conscience of Rome, the last true Republican standing when the whole system was crumbling. And his battle with Caesar wasn't just political, it was philosophical, it was personal, and it literally tore the Roman Republic apart.
This is the ultimate heavyweight match, except instead of boxing gloves, they're wearing togas. And instead of a ring, it's the Senate floor. And the stakes?
Only the fate of Western civilization.
No pressure.
So let's set the scene. We're talking about Rome in the 1st century BC, specifically about 70 BC to 46 BC. The Roman Republic is about 500 years old at this point, and it's in crisis.
De fine crisis.
Political chaos, military strongmen, corruption everywhere, the whole system that made Rome great, the checks and balances, the Senate, the rule of law, it's all breaking down.
So basically they're us in about 10 years.
Mark.
What? I'm just saying. I see the parallels.
The Republic is like a really expensive car that keeps making weird noises, but everyone just turns up the radio instead of taking it to the mechanic.
So, very American of them.
Except their version of turning up the radio was giving more power to military generals, which, as you can imagine, didn't end well.
So, into this chaos step our two heroes.
Two men with completely opposite visions for Rome's future. Julius Caesar and Cato the Younger. Now, here's the thing, they didn't start as enemies. Both came from old Roman families, both highly educated, both brilliant, but they took completely different paths.
What made Cato different?
Cato was a Stoic, capital S, not like, oh, he didn't show emotion. I mean, he was a hardcore follower of Stoic philosophy. He believed in virtue above everything. He believed in the Republic above everything. He would rather die, literally die, than compromise his principles.
That's the kind of guy who either saves the world or drives everyone absolutely insane.
Both. He did both. Cato was born in 95 B. C, full name, Marcus Porcius Cato Udicensis. He was the great-grandson of Cato the Elder, who was also a famous Roman politician. So right away, he's got this legacy to live up to.
Generational pressure. I relate to that. My dad was a successful engineer. Do you know what it's like growing up in that shadow?
Mark, we're talking about Rome.
I'm just saying, I understand the pressure.
Anyway, Cato's father died when he was young, so he was raised by his uncle Marcus Livius Drusus. Now, Drusus was a reformer, a tribune, which was basically an elected official who had veto power over the Senate. He tried to extend Roman citizenship to more people, and he was murdered for it.
Wait, murdered?
Stabbed to death. Welcome to Roman politics.
Jesus Christ.
So young Cato grew up watching his uncle try to do the right thing and get killed for it. That shapes you.
Yeah, I'd say so. That's like watching your hero get destroyed for being decent.
Exactly. So Cato became obsessed with virtue, with doing the right thing, no matter the cost. He studied Stoic philosophy intensely. He'd walk around Rome barefoot in winter to toughen himself up.
I'm sorry, barefoot?
Barefoot. Like on purpose to build discipline.
That's insane. Rome's streets were filled with, I don't even want to know what.
Oh, you don't. Romans threw their garbage out windows. Chamber pots, dead animals, everything. The streets were basically open sewers.
And this guy walked around barefoot.
That's commitment to your brand.
That's the ancient version of those wellness influencers who do cold plunges at 5 a.m.
Ha! That's actually perfect. Cato was the original cold plunge guy. He refused to wear fancy clothes, lived simply, believed that Rome's greatness came from moral character, from the discipline of its citizens, from the strength of its institutions, and he saw all of that eroding.
And then there's Caesar.
Then there's Caesar, born in 100 B.C., about 5 years before Cato. Julius Caesar came from an old patrician family, the Julians, which claimed descent from the goddess Venus through the Trojan hero Aeneas.
My great-great-great-grandmother was a goddess. Sure, mate. Mine was too.
Right? But Caesar was brilliant, charismatic, wildly ambitious. Here's what people forget, though he was broke for most of his early career. His family had prestige but not money. And in Rome, you needed money to advance politically.
So what did he do?
He borrowed massively, made alliances with rich men like Crassus, who was basically the richest man in Rome. But here's the key. Caesar understood that the Republic was changing. The old aristocratic system wasn't working anymore. And instead of fighting that change like Cato, he wrote it.
So Cato wanted to save the old system and Caesar was building the new one.
Exactly. Now, before they became enemies, Caesar had this wild experience that really shows his character. When he was about 25 years old, he was sailing to Rhodes to study philosophy.
Philosophy?
Romans loved Greek philosophy, very fashionable. But on the way, his ship got captured by pirates.
Pirates?
Cilician pirates. They were a huge problem in the Mediterranean. And they kidnapped Caesar and demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver.
How much is that?
A lot, maybe $500,000 in today's money. But here's where it gets insane. Caesar laughed at them.
He laughed?
He laughed and said, 20 talents? I'm worth at least 50 talents. And he made them increase the ransom demand.
I'm sorry? Run that by me again.
He was insulted that they undervalued him. So he made the pirates demand more money for his release.
That's the most arrogant thing I've ever heard.
Wait, it gets better. While he's there prisoner for 38 days waiting for the ransom to arrive, Caesar just hangs out with the pirates. He writes poetry, exercises, joins in their games, tells them to be quiet when he wants to sleep. And he keeps telling them, you know, when I get released, I'm going to come back and crucify all of you.
He told them this to their faces?
To their faces, repeatedly. And the pirates thought he was joking. They thought it was hilarious. This young Roman nobleman making threats. Sure, kid.
Let me guess.
The ransom gets paid. Caesar goes free. He immediately raises a small fleet, sails back, captures the pirates, and crucifies every single one of them.
He actually did it.
He actually did it. But here's where Caesar shows his mercy. He had their throats cut first before the crucifixion.
That's not mercy. That's efficient murder.
That's Caesar. He told you exactly what he was going to do. You laughed, and then he did exactly what he said. That's his entire career in one story. Promise something, deliver it, whether you like it or not.
That's terrifying.
That's why he won. Caesar never bluffed. Anyway, Caesar and Cato first really clashed in 63 BC during the Catiline conspiracy. There was this guy named Lucius Sergius Catiline, who'd lost several elections, was drowning in debt, and decided to overthrow the Republic.
As you do when you're broke and angry.
As you do. He gathered a bunch of other disgruntled aristocrats and veterans, plotted to murder the consuls. The consuls were like co-presidents, 2 elected every year, and burned down Rome. The plot gets discovered by the consul Cicero, who's one of the greatest orators in Roman history.
I love Cicero. Guy could talk.
Oh, he could talk. Gave these incredible speeches in the Senate, exposing the conspiracy, the famous Catiline orations. Then the question became, what do we do with the conspirators we've arrested?
And this is where Cato and Caesar fight?
This is where they have their first major public confrontation. Caesar argued for mercy, said these guys are Roman citizens, they deserve a trial, can't just execute them without due process. Very progressive position.
That's reasonable.
Politically, it made Caesar look good. Reasonable, merciful, lawful. Plus, some people suspected he might have been connected to the conspiracy himself, so this was a way to distance himself. But then Cato stood up in the Senate.
Ooh.
Cato gave one of the most powerful speeches of his career. He said, these men try to destroy Rome. They don't deserve a trial. They deserve death immediately for the safety of the Republic. The Senate voted with Cato. The conspirators were executed that same day.
So Cato wins round 1.
Cato wins round 1. But here's what's important. This establishes the pattern. Caesar uses the law to gain popularity and power. Cato uses the law to defend the Republic, no matter how brutal it looks. They're on a collision course. And meanwhile, the Republic is falling apart around them.
Because?
Because in 60 BC, Caesar does something brilliant and dangerous. He forms the first triumvirate with Crassus and Pompey the Great.
Okay, explain Pompey. Because he's a big deal, right?
Pompey was the big deal. Gnaeus Pompeius, Magnus Pompey the Great, Rome's most successful general at that time. He'd conquered huge territories in the east, defeated pirates, put down slave revolts, military hero. They called him Magnus as the Great when he was only in his 20s.
So he's like the star quarterback who everyone loves.
Exactly. Except he was also kind of a brute. His enemies called him Agilus Enchilus Carnifex, the teenage butcher, because of how violent he was in his early campaigns.
Charming nickname.
But here's the thing about Pompey. Brilliant general, terrible politician, just absolutely awful at politics.
How so?
He couldn't read people. He'd make alliances and then alienate everyone. He married Caesar's daughter Julia at one point, and when she died during childbirth in 54 BC, their political alliance basically died with her. And Pompey once said, I'm quoting here, "I only have to stamp my foot and legions will spring from the soil of Italy."
Did they?
They did not.
Awkward.
Very awkward. But in 60 BC, Pompey teams up with Caesar and Crassus to form the triumvirate.
Wait, explain what a triumvirate actually is.
Good question. It's basically an informal political alliance between three powerful men, not an official government position. More like, imagine the three richest, most powerful people in your country secretly deciding to run everything together.
So it's like when tech billionaires all meet for dinner and you just know they're planning something.
Exactly. Or like when three celebrities start a tequila company together.
Laughs. Oh my God, it always is three, isn't it?
It's always three. It's never two, never four, and it always ends badly. Someone always gets pushed out or betrayed.
So the tequila is Caesar and the friendship is the Republic.
That's surprisingly profound.
I have my moments.
So Caesar needs military command to build power and pay off his massive debts. Pompey needs land for his veterans who served in his campaigns. Crassus wants more wealth and influence. They all help each other. And Cato sees this and loses his mind.
How mad are we talking?
Cato gives speech after speech in the Senate warning that this is the end of the Republic, that these three men are concentrating too much power, bypassing traditional rules, and he's absolutely right. But nobody listens.
Why not?
Because Caesar's smart. He proposes popular reforms. Land for veterans, debt relief, grain subsidies, things people actually want. And Cato opposes them because he sees them as illegal power grabs, which makes Cato look like he's against helping people when really he's trying to save the constitutional system.
So Cato's technically right, but politically stupid.
That's Cato's entire career in one sentence. He's principled to the point of inflexibility. And at one point, Caesar got so frustrated with Cato's filibustering in the Senate that he had him physically dragged out of the chamber.
He dragged him out?
Had the guards drag him out. Cato was mid-speech, talking for hours to block a vote on Caesar's proposals. And Caesar just said, remove him. Just guards, get him out of here.
That's wild.
Here's what's wilder. Other senators actually followed Cato out in protest, just got up and left the Senate to show solidarity. Because even though Cato was annoying, he represented something important to them.
See, that's backbone.
Or stubbornness, depending on your perspective. Anyway, Caesar gets himself elected consul in 59 BC, and then he gets a 5-year command in Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium.
The Gallic Wars.
The Gallic Wars. This is where Caesar becomes Caesar. He spends the next 8 years conquering Gaul, fighting Germanic tribes, even crossing to Britain twice. He writes these brilliant commentaries about his campaigns, basically inventing war propaganda and self-promotion through written reports.
I came, I saw, I conquered.
That's later, but yes. Veni, Vidi, Vici, 3 words. Most baller military report ever written.
Peak Caesar.
Peak Caesar. And the whole time he's away campaigning, he's building this incredibly loyal army. His soldiers love him because he fights alongside them, shares their hardships, remembers their names. Meanwhile, in 53 BC, Crassus, remember him, richest man in Rome, decides he wants military glory too.
Ooh.
Is right. Crassus invades Parthia, basically modern-day Iran and Iraq, and gets absolutely destroyed at the Battle of Carrhae. The Parthians kill about 20,000 Romans and capture another 10,000. And Crassus himself is killed. And according to legend, the Parthians pour molten gold down his throat as a symbol of his greed.
Pause. I'm sorry. Molten gold?
That's the legend. Probably not actually true, but it's such a good story that historians kept repeating it.
That's horrifying.
That's the Parthians. Don't mess with the Parthians. Anyway, Crassus dies in 53 BC, which means the triumvirate is down to 2. Caesar's in Gaul conquering everything. Pompey's in Rome getting jealous.
Jealous of what?
Jealous that Caesar's winning all this glory. See, when Caesar left for Gaul in 58 B, Pompey was Rome's golden boy, the great general, the hero. But now Caesar's the one everyone's talking about. Did you hear what Caesar did in Gaul? He crossed the Rhine. He went to Britain twice, and Cato sees his opening.
To turn them against each other.
Cato starts working on Pompey, telling him Caesar's the real threat, that Caesar's going to come back from Gaul with this massive army and take over. And slowly, Pompey starts to believe it. His ego can't handle being second to Caesar. Then in 52 B.C., things get violent in Rome. There's literal gang warfare in the streets, political gangs battling it out. One of the gang leaders, a guy named Clodius, gets killed in a street fight, and his followers burn down the Senate house with his body inside as a funeral pyre.
They burn down the Senate?
Burn it to the ground. Rome's in chaos, riots everywhere, blood in the streets. And the Senate does something desperate. They make Pompey the sole consul.
Just Pompey? No colleague?
Just Pompey, which is basically unconstitutional. You're supposed to have two consuls to check each other's power. But the Senate's terrified of total anarchy, so they give all power to Pompey. And Cato supports this.
Wait, Cato supports breaking the rules?
This is where it gets messy for Cato. He supports it because he thinks Pompey's the lesser evil compared to Caesar, but he's compromising the very republic he's trying to save. He's bending the constitutional rules to fight someone he thinks is breaking them, and Cato eventually arranges for his own daughter to marry Pompey's ally Metellus Scipio to cement the anti-Caesar coalition.
That's the problem with zealots, isn't it? Eventually you become what you're fighting.
Ooh, that's dark. But yeah, and this sets up the final confrontation. Caesar's in Gaul with a battle-hardened loyal army. Pompey's in Rome with the Senate's backing and constitutional legitimacy. Cato's working behind the scenes to make sure they go to war.
So Cato wants war?
Cato wants Caesar brought to justice. He wants Caesar to come home as a private citizen without his army, face charges for his illegal acts as consul, and submit to the law.
And Caesar says
absolutely not. Because if he gives up his army and returns as a private citizen, Cato and his allies will destroy him, prosecute him, exile him, ruin him politically and financially. So Caesar demands to keep his army and run for consul in absentia while still commanding troops in Gaul.
And Cato says no.
Cato says absolutely not. No compromise, no negotiation, face the law, or be declared a public enemy of Rome. And this is where Cato makes his fatal mistake. He's so rigid, so unbending, so committed to the letter of the law that he gives Caesar no choice but war.
Because if Caesar gives up his army,
he's finished. Politically dead. Maybe literally dead. So in January of 49 BC, Caesar makes his decision. He takes one legion, the 13th Legion, about 5,000 men, and marches to the Rubicon River.
The famous Rubicon.
Which, by the way, was a tiny, unimpressive stream. You could probably jump across it like a creek.
Wait, really?
Really. The mighty Rubicon that everyone talks about was basically a drainage ditch, but it was the legal boundary between Gaul Caesar's province, where he had military authority, and Italy proper, and Roman law said no general could cross it with an army. If you did, you were automatically considered a traitor, automatic death sentence.
So by crossing a creek with 5,000 guys, Caesar just declared war on Rome.
He declared war on the Republic itself. And according to tradition, he quoted a Greek playwright named Menander, Affinio epsilon rho rhi phtheta omega, kappa beta omicrons, let the die be cast. Though in Latin it became alia iacta est.
That's the line everyone knows.
That's the line. And it meant no turning back now. We're doing this. The gamble is made.
So what happens next?
Panic. Absolute panic in Rome. Because nobody expected Caesar to actually do it. They thought he'd negotiate, back down, accept some compromise. But Caesar just called their bluff and marched on Rome with one legion.
And Pompey.
Pompey realizes he's not ready. His legions are scattered, some in Spain, some in the east. He doesn't have enough forces in Italy to stop Caesar immediately. So he makes this controversial decision. He abandons Rome.
He just leaves?
He tells the Senate, we're evacuating, we're going to Greece to regroup, gather our forces, and come back stronger. And Cato has to make a choice. Does he stay in Rome and try to negotiate with Caesar? Or does he go with Pompey and the Senate?
He goes with Pompey.
He goes with Pompey. Because for Cato, Pompey represents the legitimate republic, even in exile. Even if they're fleeing, they're still the constitutional government. So Cato leaves Rome, the city he loves, the republic. He's dedicated his life to defending and sails to Greece. And it's one of the saddest moments of his life.
And Caesar just walks into Rome unopposed.
Walks into Rome unopposed, no battle, no resistance. The city opens its gates. And here's what's interesting. Caesar's surprisingly restrained. He doesn't declare himself dictator immediately. He doesn't execute his enemies. He talks about reconciliation, healing Rome's divisions, bringing everyone back together. He offers pardons to anyone who'll accept them.
That's actually generous.
That's clever. Caesar's always playing the long game. Make yourself look like the peacemaker, the reasonable one, the father figure who just wants unity. Meanwhile, in Greece, Pompey's gathering forces from across the eastern Mediterranean, and Cato's there organising supplies, keeping the resistance alive, being the moral centre of the anti-Caesar movement.
Wow, deception everywhere.
So we've got Caesar in Rome, Pompey and Cato in Greece preparing for the big showdown. When does it happen?
48 BC, August 9th, the Battle of Pharsalus in central Greece. It's the decisive confrontation, Caesar's army versus Pompey's army. And on paper, Pompey should win easily.
Why?
He has way more soldiers, about 45,000 infantry to Caesar's 22,000, better cavalry, better position, fresh supplies from the east. But Caesar's troops are veterans of 8 years of Gallic campaigns. They've been fighting together, bleeding together. They're disciplined, experienced, and fanatically loyal to Caesar.
And Pompey's forces?
Pompey's forces are mixed quality. Some are veterans from his earlier campaigns, but many are new recruits from the eastern provinces, and Pompey himself hasn't commanded troops in active combat for years. He's been doing politics in Rome. He's rusty. So when the battle starts, Caesar does this brilliant tactical maneuver.
What does he do?
He hides a fourth line of infantry behind his right wing. Pompey's cavalry, which was his advantage, charges the Roman right, thinking they're going to roll over Caesar's flank. And suddenly this hidden reserve of infantry comes out at the perfect moment with spears aimed at the cavalrymen's faces, and they break Pompey's cavalry completely.
Surprise infantry. That's genius.
Pure tactical genius. Pompey's cavalry panics, retreats, and the whole battle line collapses. It's a complete rout.
How bad are the casualties?
About 15,000 of Pompey's soldiers killed on the field, 24,000 captured. Caesar's losses, around 200 men.
200 versus 15,000?
Caesar was that good, one of the greatest military commanders in history. And Pompey sees his army disintegrating, and he just leaves, abandons the battlefield, takes off his general's insignia, puts on civilian clothes, and flees. The great Pompey, the great, running away.
That's humiliating.
Completely humiliating. He flees to Egypt, to the court of the young pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII.
Egypt? Why Egypt?
Egypt's a Roman client state. Pompey had helped Ptolemy's father years before. He thinks he can get support, regroup, maybe raise another army. But when Pompey's ship arrives at Alexandria on September 28th, 48 BC, the Egyptians are like, Caesar just won. We're not backing a loser.
So what do?
They murder him. Ptolemy's advisors decide the safest bet is to kill Pompey and present his head to Caesar as a gift. So they send a welcoming party out to Pompey's boat, and when Pompey steps into their boat thinking he's being honoured, they stab him to death in front of his wife and son.
Jesus Christ.
Then they cut off his head and preserve it to show Caesar.
That is brutal.
Ancient politics was not for the faint of heart. And when Caesar arrives in Egypt a few days later and they present him with Pompey's head, Caesar allegedly wept. Because Pompey had been his son-in-law years before Pompey had married Caesar's daughter Julia, before she died in childbirth.
Do you think the tears were real?
I think Caesar was a great actor. He knew how to play an audience. Were the tears real? Maybe partly. But Caesar also knew how to look magnanimous, merciful, saddened by necessity. It's good theatre.
So Pompey's dead, September 28th, 48 BC. What about Cato?
Cato wasn't at Pharsalus. He was commanding naval forces and defending Sicily and North Africa. And when he hears about the catastrophic defeat at Pharsalus and Pompey's murder, he refuses to give up. Absolutely refuses.
He keeps fighting?
He gathers the remaining Republican commanders and retreats to North Africa, to the province of Africa, modern-day Tunisia and Libya. He links up with other diehard Republicans, with King Juba of Numidia, with anyone who still resists Caesar. And he makes his headquarters at the coastal city of Utica.
And Caesar? What's he doing?
Caesar stays in Egypt for a while, gets involved in their civil war between Ptolemy the 13th and his sister wife Cleopatra. This is where he meets Cleopatra, by the way.
The Cleopatra?
The Cleopatra. Cleopatra the 7th. She was 21 years old. He was 52.
That's that's gross by modern standards.
By modern standards, absolutely. By Roman standards, totally normal age gap for a powerful man. Anyway, Caesar backs Cleopatra in a civil war, defeats Ptolemy, puts Cleopatra on the throne. They have a son together, Caesarion. Then Caesar leaves Egypt and campaigns in Asia Minor, where he crushes a rebellion so quickly he sends back that famous 3-word message, Veni, Vidi, Vici.
I came, I saw, I conquered.
3 words. The most efficient after-action report ever written. Peak Roman arrogance.
But eventually he has to deal with Cato and the Republicans in Africa.
Eventually. In 46 BC, Caesar sailed to North Africa with his army. The Republicans have regrouped. They've got King Juba's forces. They've got hardened veterans who'd rather die than surrender to Caesar. The final battle happens at Thapsus on April 6, 46 BC.
How does it go?
Complete disaster for the Republicans. Caesar wins decisively again. His tactical brilliance, his veteran legions, they're just too much. The Republican forces are crushed. Thousands killed. King Juba takes his own life rather than be captured by Caesar. Other Republican leaders either surrender or die.
And Cato's in Utica, knowing it's over.
Cato's in Utica, knowing the cause is lost. The Republic is dead. And this is where he becomes legendary. He spends his last days putting his affairs in order very carefully, making sure his friends and supporters can escape safely. He arranges ships for them, gives them money, writes letters of introduction.
He's preparing to die.
He's preparing to die on his own terms. His son, also named Marcus, begs him to flee. Father, we can get you out. We can keep fighting. Come with us. But Cato refuses. His friends plead with him. But Cato's made his decision.
Why?
Because to Cato, living in Caesar's Rome, living under a dictatorship, even a benevolent one would be worse than death. He believed in the Republic, absolutely. The rule of law, the Senate, the Constitution, and if those things were dead, he didn't want to live as a subject to a tyrant.
That's principled. I'll give him that.
On his last night, Cato has dinner with his friends and companions. They have a philosophical discussion about stoicism, about virtue, about whether a wise man should ever take his own life. Then Cato goes to his room, and the book he chooses to read is Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo.
What's that about?
It's about Socrates' last day alive before his execution, about his philosophical arguments for the immortality of the soul, about choosing death with dignity rather than living without freedom.
Oh no.
Cato reads it cover to cover, then he reads it again, twice through. Then, after everyone's gone to bed, he takes his sword.
Mike, please tell me he doesn't.
He stabs himself in the stomach.
Oh God.
His servants hear the noise, the sound of his body hitting the floor. They rush in and find him bleeding from a massive wound. They call a doctor who's in Utica. The doctor manages to stitch up the wound. Cato seems stable. He's lost a lot of blood, but he might survive. Everyone breathes a sigh of relief. They post guards. They leave him to rest.
And
Mark, when they leave the room, Cato waits. Just waits, calmly. Then he reaches down, rips open the stitches with his bare hands, and pulls out his own intestines.
long pause. I'm sorry. What?
He pulled out his own intestines with his hands.
That's the most metal thing I've ever heard. And also I need therapy now.
He was 48 years old, and his death shocked the entire Roman world. This wasn't just a political suicide. This was a statement, a manifesto written in blood.
What kind of statement?
It said, I will not bow to tyranny. I will not compromise my principles. I will not live in a world where one man has absolute power. I will not accept Caesar's mercy because Caesar has no right to offer mercy. He's not my king. He's not my master. I am a free citizen of a free republic, and I'll die free before I live as a slave.
He became a martyr?
He became the martyr for Republican liberty. And it created a massive political problem for Caesar.
Why? Caesar had won everything.
Because Caesar had been offering pardons to everyone. His whole political brand after the Civil War was clemency, mercy, forgiveness. Come back. All is forgiven. Let's rebuild Rome together. But Cato's death was basically a huge middle finger to that entire narrative. It said, your mercy is worthless. Your power is illegitimate. I'd rather die than accept anything from you.
So Cato wins in death?
In a way. Caesar was so bothered by Cato's suicide that he wrote an entire pamphlet attacking Cato's memory. A political hit piece called The Anti-Cato.
What did it say?
Caesar called Cato a drunk, a hypocrite, a bad husband, someone who'd mismanaged money, basically tried to destroy his reputation posthumously.
Wait, a drunk?
Oh yeah, we need to talk about that. Cato was famous for getting absolutely hammered every night.
I'm sorry, what?
Cato, the great Stoic philosopher, the paragon of Roman virtue, would drink wine heavily every single evening. Like, serious drinking.
How do we know this?
Multiple sources mention it. His enemies said he was a full-on alcoholic. His supporters said he needed to relax from his labours, and that wine helped him think clearly.
So the guy who walked around barefoot preaching virtue was getting drunk every night?
Every single night. Cold plunge in the morning, drunk at night. The ancient Roman wellness influencer lifestyle.
That's hilarious.
It's very human, which is kind of the point. Cato wasn't some perfect saint. He was a deeply flawed, complicated, sometimes insufferable man who happened to have unshakable principles about the Republic.
And Caesar attacked him for the drinking?
Caesar attacked him for everything, but it backfired spectacularly.
How?
Because the more Caesar attacked Cato, the more people defended him. Writers started lionizing Cato. Marcus Brutus, who was Cato's nephew by marriage, wrote a response pamphlet defending Cato. Other writers joined in. Cato became this symbol of everything the Republic stood for.
So Cato's death becomes Caesar's problem.
Cato's death becomes Caesar's nightmare because it showed that some people couldn't be bought, couldn't be pardoned, couldn't be won over, and it inspired others.
Inspired them to what?
To kill Caesar. 2 years later, in 44 BC, on March 15th, the Ides of March, a group of senators, including Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, stabbed Caesar to death in the Senate. 23 stab wounds.
And they cited Cato?
They called themselves the Liberators. Said they were defending the Republic just like Cato had. Brutus, Cato's nephew, put Cato's image on coins after Caesar's death. Cato became the ideological justification for tyrannicide.
So Cato's suicide directly led to Caesar's assassination.
It created the philosophical framework. It showed that tyranny, even enlightened tyranny, was intolerable, that some things were worth dying for, and that inspired the conspiracy against Caesar.
Did it work? Did they save the Republic?
No. The conspirators failed completely. Caesar's assassination triggered another round of civil wars. Mark Antony versus Octavian versus the Senate. More battles, more deaths. And eventually, Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, became Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Republic was dead and buried.
So everyone lost?
Everyone lost. Cato lost his life. Caesar lost his life. Pompey lost his life. Cicero got hunted down and murdered too. The Republic died. Rome got emperors who pretended to be Republican while wielding absolute power. It was a complete catastrophe.
Such happy stories. We seem to specialize in those. Okay, so we've covered the political destruction and the military campaigns, but I want to dig into who these people actually were as human beings because they're fascinating, complicated characters.
I mean, we know the broad outlines. Cato was the rigid stoic who got drunk and walked barefoot. Caesar was the ambitious general who was vain about his bald spot. But what were they actually like?
Let's start with Cato's contradictions. On one hand, he's this moral exemplar that everyone either admires or hates, lives simply, refuses bribes, walks around barefoot preaching virtue. But he was also kind of insufferable to be around.
How so?
There are multiple stories about Cato in the Senate just droning on for hours and hours about virtue and duty and the old Roman ways while everyone else wanted to go home for dinner.
Oh, he was that guy. The guy who makes every meeting run 3 hours long because he has principles.
Exactly that guy. And he weaponized it. He used filibustering as a tactic. He'd just talk and talk and talk to prevent votes he didn't like. Literal hours of non-stop talking.
So he invented the filibuster?
He perfected it. There's a famous story where he talked for an entire day, sunrise to sunset, to prevent a vote on Caesar's Gallic command. Other senators tried to shut him up, tried to move on, but Cato just kept going. Eventually, Caesar got so fed up, he had the guards physically remove Cato from the Senate floor mid-speech.
That's commitment to being annoying.
And here's the thing, Cato knew he was annoying. He didn't care. He thought being popular was a sign of moral failure. He'd quote Stoic philosophers about how the wise man doesn't seek approval from the masses, which is great philosophy. Terrible politics.
What about his personal life?
His personal life was weird and kind of disturbing. He was married twice, first to a woman named Attilia. They divorced for reasons we don't fully know. Then he married Marcia, daughter of a prominent senator. And this is where it gets really strange.
How strange?
So Cato had this wealthy friend named Quintus Hortensius Hortulus. Famous orator, very rich, getting older, and Hortensius wanted an heir to inherit his massive fortune, but his wife was past childbearing age.
Okay.
So Hortensius asked Cato if he could marry Marcia to father children and heirs.
I'm sorry, what?
Hortensius asked to marry Cato's wife, and Cato said yes.
He just said yes?
Cato divorced Marcia so she could marry Hortensius. They had children together. Then when Hortensius died a few years later, leaving Marcia very wealthy, Cato remarried her.
Let me get this straight. Cato divorces his wife, gives her to his rich elderly friend so the friend can have heirs. Friend dies and leaves her a fortune. Cato remarries the now wealthy widow.
That's exactly what happened.
That's not Stoicism. That's a Hallmark movie written by a divorce attorney and a financial planner.
Right? And even by Roman standards, this was scandalous. Some people thought it showed Cato's selflessness. He put his friend's needs above his own desires. Others thought it showed he didn't really value his wife as a person, just as a transaction.
I'm going with option 2. That's messed up.
Modern historians debate it, but it shows how Cato's Stoicism could be taken to weird extremes. He'd sacrifice personal feelings, personal relationships for what he saw as philosophical virtue or duty to a friend.
What about Caesar? What was he actually like as a person?
Caesar was basically the opposite of Cato in every way. Charismatic, charming, incredibly vain about his appearance.
Vain how?
Obsessed with how he looked. He wore his toga in this distinctive way with a loose belt that conservative Romans thought was effeminate and fashion forward, but Caesar didn't care what they thought.
Was he really that bothered by going bald?
Oh, he was losing his hair and he absolutely hated it. He tried everything, combing his hair forward from the back of his head to hide the bald spot, supposedly wore special hair treatments.
And the laurel wreath?
Eventually, the Senate granted him the privilege of wearing a laurel wreath at all public occasions, theoretically to honour his military victories, but everyone knew it was really to cover up his bald spot, and he wore it everywhere, tilted forward to maximise coverage.
So he's out conquering Gaul, reforming the calendar, crossing the Rubicon, nearly becoming king of Rome, but he's worried about his hairline.
Bald guy energy. Very human, very relatable actually.
That's what makes him interesting, isn't it? He's this towering genius of military strategy and politics, but he's also insecure about going bald.
Exactly. He's human. And Caesar was also a notorious womanizer and had affairs with multiple prominent Roman women.
Like who?
The most important was Servilia.
Who's Servilia?
Servilia was one of the most powerful women in Rome, came from an old aristocratic family, and she was Caesar's longtime mistress, like for decades. They had this passionate on and off affair that was basically an open secret in Rome
And why does this matter?
because Servilia was Brutus's mother.
Wait. Caesar was having an affair with Brutus's mother?
For years, probably started when Brutus was a child. And here's where it gets even more complicated. Servilia was also Cato's half-sister.
Oh my God.
Caesar was sleeping with his greatest enemy's sister, who was also the mother of the man who would eventually assassinate him.
This is better than any soap opera.
Ancient Rome was a soap opera. And there were persistent rumours, never proven but widely believed, that Brutus might actually have been Caesar's biological son.
From the affair with Servilia?
From the affair with Servilia. The timeline works. Servilia and Caesar were involved around the time Brutus was conceived. And Caesar always showed Brutus special favour, even after Brutus fought against him in the Civil War. Protected him, promoted him, treated him almost like a son.
So, when Brutus stabbed Caesar on the Ides of March, he might have been killing his own father?
Possibly. We'll never know for sure. But Caesar's last words might not have been "Et tu, Brute," like Shakespeare wrote. Some sources say he spoke in Greek, "Kalphai sigmao, taue kapanu, omikronu." You too, child?
That's tragic.
That's Roman history. Tragic, complicated, and deeply personal. These weren't just political conflicts. These were family dramas playing out on the stage of empire.
Did the Romans care about all these affairs?
They gossiped about them constantly. Caesar had other affairs too. There were rumors about him and King Nicomedes of Bithynia when Caesar was a young man.
A king? Like a Moloch king?
Yes. The rumor was that young Caesar had a sexual relationship with King Nicomedes, and Caesar's enemies in the Senate would mock him for it, calling him the Queen of Bithynia.
And Romans cared about that?
It's complicated. Romans had different attitudes about sexuality than we do. They were fine with men having male lovers, but they cared a lot about who was the dominant versus passive partner. Being the active partner was fine. Being passive was seen as shameful and unmanly.
Roman sexuality was weird.
Roman, everything was weird by modern standards. But Caesar's enemies used these rumours to try to embarrass him politically.
Did it work?
Not really. Caesar was so confident and politically powerful that he just brushed it off. He had a comeback for everything.
That's the difference, isn't it? Cato cared desperately what people thought of his virtue and reputation. Caesar didn't care what people thought at all.
Exactly. Caesar understood that power mattered more than reputation. As long as he had his legions, his wealth, his political network, and his military genius, gossip couldn't touch him.
But Cato believed reputation was everything.
Because for Cato, virtue was everything. And virtue required a public reputation. You couldn't be virtuous in secret. You had to be publicly, visibly, conspicuously moral so that others would follow your example and Rome would be saved.
So he was performatively virtuous.
I wouldn't say it was fake or performative. I think Cato genuinely believed all of it. But yes, there was definitely an element of, I'm going to be so morally pure that you'll all be ashamed of your corruption.
Did it work?
Sometimes. Cato shamed people into voting correctly. He exposed corruption. He prevented some truly awful legislation. He was the conscience of the Senate, but he also alienated potential allies because he couldn't forgive human weakness or make practical compromises.
Give me an example.
Okay, there was this senator named Metellus Scipio, mediocre politician, came from one of Rome's greatest families. Scipio committed some corrupt acts early in his career, bribery, probably electoral fraud, and Cato publicly destroyed him. Just absolutely eviscerated him in Senate speeches, called him out by name, demanded investigations.
Good for Cato.
Except years later, when Cato desperately needed allies against Caesar during the Civil War, he had to work with Metellus Scipio. And it was incredibly awkward because Cato had spent years calling him corrupt and incompetent.
That's politics, I guess.
It gets weirder. To cement the anti-Caesar alliance, Cato eventually arranged for his own daughter to marry Metellus Scipio.
Wait, he married his daughter to a guy he'd publicly called corrupt?
Yep. For political necessity, which shows you how desperate things had become. And it shows Cato's fundamental weakness. He was so focused on being morally right that he didn't build the relationships he needed to actually win politically.
Whereas Caesar was building relationships constantly.
Caesar was a master of people. He remembered everyone's name. He gave generous gifts. He loaned money to struggling senators, not because he was kind, but because then they owed him. He hosted lavish games and banquets. He made people feel special and important,
even though everyone knew he was dangerous.
Especially because he was dangerous. Caesar made you feel like you were on his team, like you were special, like together you were going to build something great for Rome. He was incredibly charismatic, and he was genuinely brave, fought alongside his soldiers, shared their dangers, was wounded multiple times in battle.
So his troops loved him.
His troops would literally die for him. They followed him across the Rubicon knowing it meant civil war. They fought for him in Gaul for 8 years. They marched through winter campaigns because Caesar made them believe they were the best, and he treated them with respect.
And that's why he won and Cato lost.
Ultimately, yes. Caesar built a coalition, soldiers, veterans, common people, debtors, anyone who felt left out of the traditional senatorial system. He offered them something better. Cato defended the existing system without reforming it, even though that system was corrupt and failing.
But Cato had supporters too, right?
Cato had strong support among the senatorial elite, among the Optimates, the conservative faction. But these were mostly wealthy old men who wanted to preserve their privileges and power, not exactly a broad-based popular movement.
So Cato was fighting for the people in theory, but not in practice.
Bingo. He believed the Republic was good for everyone, but in reality, it mainly benefited the wealthy. When Caesar proposed land reforms for veterans, Cato opposed them because they were legally questionable. When Caesar proposed debt relief, Cato opposed it as a violation of property rights.
So Cato defended a broken system because it was the legitimate system.
He defended constitutional order even when that order wasn't serving most Romans. And the big question is, was Caesar's alternative actually better?
Dictatorship? I mean, dictatorship is bad, right? That's basic civics.
In theory, yes. But here's the thing. Caesar did accomplish real reforms. He reformed the calendar, creating what we call the Julian calendar. That's basically what we still use today. He started massive building projects that employed thousands. He extended citizenship to more people. He enacted debt relief. He settled his veterans on land.
So he was a benevolent dictator.
For a while, until he wasn't. That's the eternal problem with dictatorship. It depends entirely on the virtue of the dictator. Caesar might have been relatively benevolent, but what happens when the dictator dies?
You get civil war again.
You get civil war, which is exactly what happened after the Ides of March. So maybe they were both wrong, or maybe the whole situation was impossible and tragic and there was no good solution.
Again, one of our feel-good stories.
All right, so we've covered the history, the battles, the personalities, the affairs. But Mike, I want to ask you something that's been on my mind.
What's that?
Why do we still care about two dead Romans from 2,000 years ago?
Because they're us, Mark.
What do you mean?
I mean, every political crisis, every constitutional moment, every time a democracy faces a strongman or a zealot, we're replaying Cato and Caesar. We're asking the same questions they asked, making the same choices.
Such as?
When is it okay to break the rules to save the system? If the system is corrupt, do you work within it or tear it down? How do you balance idealism with pragmatism? When does defending institutions become defending injustice?
Those are the exact debates we're having right now.
Exactly. Think about politics anywhere in the world right now. You've got leaders claiming emergency powers, bypassing normal procedures, saying the old system doesn't work anymore.
Interrupting the Caesars.
Right? And you've got people saying, no, we have to follow constitutional processes, respect institutions. The system still works if we just use it properly.
The Catos.
The Catos. And both sides are absolutely convinced they're saving democracy while the other side is destroying it.
So who's right?
That's the trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
No, seriously. Who's right?
Mark, I genuinely don't know. And I think that's the point. Sometimes the Caesars are right. Sometimes the system is so broken that it needs radical reform or even replacement.
Give me an example.
Historians debate whether FDR was acting like Caesar when he massively expanded executive power during the New Deal and World War II. He broke a lot of norms, but he probably saved American capitalism and democracy from collapsing.
But FDR didn't become a dictator.
No, because American institutions were strong enough to contain him even when he tried to pack the Supreme Court. He died in office and power transferred peacefully. The system bent but didn't break.
But what if it had broken? What if the institutions hadn't held?
Then we'd be living in a very different world. And that's what scares me.
What scares you about it? Mike, we're sitting here talking about ancient Rome like it's some distant historical curiosity, but the same patterns are playing out right now. Leaders testing boundaries, institutions under pressure, people so polarized they can't agree on basic facts.
I know.
And we're just making podcasts about it, talking about it.
What else should we be doing?
I don't know. Cato died for his principles, literally pulled out his own intestines rather than live under tyranny. Caesar crossed the Rubicon and risked everything. And we're just hoping our TikTok clips go viral.
That's not entirely fair, Mark.
Isn't it though? Are we vigilant citizens or are we just commentators watching it all happen?
Information matters. Education matters. Understanding history matters. If people don't know how Rome fell, they can't recognize the patterns and prevent it from happening again.
I hope you're right. Because my daughter Jackson is in college right now, and I honestly don't know what kind of world she's graduating into. Will democracy still exist? Will the Constitution matter? Will any of the things we took for granted still be there?
My daughter, Caroline too, she's at that ridiculously expensive school on the East Coast, and Monica and I are paying, God, we're paying so much. And I think about whether the degree will even matter if everything falls apart, whether democracy will survive until she's our age.
See, that's what I'm talking about. We're living through a potential turning point and we don't know if we're the Catos or the bystanders.
But we do have advantages Rome didn't have. We have a written constitution, independent courts, free press, regular elections, multiple checks and balances.
Rome had elections too, Mike.
Faire point.
Rome had courts. Rome had a constitution. It just wasn't written down in one document. They had checks and balances between the consuls and senate and tribunes. And it all fell apart anyway when people stopped believing in the system.
You're being dark today.
Valerie told me this morning she's worried about the country, about democracy, about the kids' future. She asked if we should leave Los Angeles and move somewhere safer. And I didn't know what to say because I don't even know where would be safer.
Monica's been saying similar things, said California feels different than when she moved here from Colorado 20 years ago.
It's not just us feeling this, is it? It's everywhere.
No, it's not just us.
So what do we do? How do we make sure we don't become Rome?
I think, wait, what was I saying?
You're doing your thing again.
What thing?
Wait, what was I saying? You do it when you're trying to organize your thoughts.
Oh, right. Okay, here's what I think. We study history. We understand these patterns. We make different choices than Rome made. We find the balance between Cato and Caesar.
But what if there is no balance? What if those are the only two options?
Then we're screwed. But I don't think that's true. Cato represented one failed solution: preserve order at all costs, even if it means resisting necessary change, even if the system you're defending is fundamentally broken. Caesar represented the other failed solution: achieve change at all costs, even if it means destroying liberty and constitutional government.
And the answer is somewhere in between.
The answer has to be somewhere in between. You need strong institutions that can adapt. You need leaders principled enough to respect those institutions, but pragmatic enough to reform them when necessary. And you need citizens who are vigilant.
That word again. Vigilant. Are we?
I don't know, Mark. Are we?
I think we're trying to be making this podcast, talking about history, connecting it to the present. Maybe that's a form of vigilance.
Did anyone in Rome try to find the middle ground, to be the moderate voice?
You mean besides us sitting here 2,000 years later?
I'm serious. Was there anyone who tried to bridge the gap between Cato and Caesar? Cicero tried. Marcus Tullius Cicero, greatest orator in Roman history, brilliant lawyer, talented writer. He tried to be the voice of reason, the compromiser, the guy who wanted constitutional reform without revolution.
What happened to him?
After Caesar was assassinated during the power struggle between Mark Antony and Octavian, Cicero opposed Antony in a series of speeches called the Philippics. He called Antony a tyrant, a drunk, a threat to the Republic.
And Antony?
Antony had him hunted down and murdered. Sent soldiers to kill him at his villa. They cut off his head and his hands, the hands that wrote the speeches, the head that spoke them and displayed them on the roster in the Roman Forum, nailed them up as a warning.
Jesus Christ, Rome.
Rome did not reward moderates. You were either Cato or Caesar. If you tried to be both, if you tried to find middle ground, you got crushed between them.
So what's the point? If even moderate voices get murdered, why bother trying?
Because sometimes the moderate voices win. Sometimes the Republic survives. Sometimes you get a George Washington who's virtuous enough to voluntarily give up power after 2 terms. Sometimes the institutions hold.
But we can't count on getting lucky with leaders.
We can't count on that, which is why the structures matter, why the institutions matter, why the culture of respecting those institutions matters. That's the real lesson. When those things break down...
When they break down, you get Rome.
You get decades of civil war, millions of people dead, dictatorship disguised as restoration of order, the Pax Romana, sure, 2 centuries of relative peace, but bought at the price of liberty.
Was it worth it? The peace in exchange for freedom?
Ask Cato. He said no. He said he'd rather die free than live as a slave to any man.
And ask Caesar?
Caesar would say he brought stability, prosperity, security, that the Republic was already dead, and he was just making it official. That his dictatorship was better than chaos.
Those are both insane positions.
They were both insane men, Mark. Brilliant, principled, ambitious, and absolutely willing to burn down the world rather than compromise their vision.
And that's the warning, isn't it?
That's the warning. 2 brilliant men destroyed each other and their entire civilization because neither could find middle ground. Neither could compromise. Neither could see the other's perspective as legitimate.
We're supposed to learn from that.
We're supposed to. But here's what I know for certain. Cato's death mattered. It mattered because it showed that some things are worth dying for. That principles aren't just abstract philosophical concepts, that liberty has value beyond politics.
But his death didn't save the Republic.
His death didn't save the Roman Republic, but it saved the IDEA of the Republic. For 2,000 years, people have read about Cato and been inspired Renaissance humanists during the age of tyrants, Enlightenment philosophers, fighting absolutism, American revolutionaries.
George Washington knew about Cato?
Washington had a play about Cato performed for his freezing, starving troops at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 1778. He wanted them to understand what they were fighting for. Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" speech. That's paraphrasing a line from that play about Cato.
So Cato influenced the American Revolution?
Hugely. The founding fathers saw themselves as modern Catos defending republican virtues and constitutional government against tyranny. They read Plutarch's biography of Cato. They quoted him in letters and speeches. He was the model.
And did it work? Did they do better than Rome?
We're still here, aren't we? 250 years later. American democracy is messy, frustrating, constantly under pressure, but it's survived.
So far.
So far. And that's not reassuring, is it?
It's not meant to be reassuring. You're being honest. Democracy is hard.
Democracy is incredibly hard. Harder than dictatorship, which is easy. Harder than chaos, which requires nothing. Democracy requires constant work, constant vigilance, constant willingness to compromise without surrendering core values.
And if we're not willing to do that work,
then we get what Rome got. We get our own Caesar, who promises to fix everything if we just give him enough power. We get our own civil wars. And 2,000 years from now, future historians will write about us the way we write about Rome.
They had everything and they threw it away.
They had everything and they threw it away because they couldn't balance freedom and order. Because they let perfect be the enemy of good. Because they valued winning over governing.
No pressure?
No pressure at all. Just the fate of civilization hanging in the balance. You know, another Tuesday.
Well, this has been cheerful.
History's not always cheerful, Mark, but it's always instructive. It shows us our patterns, our mistakes, our possibilities.
So what's the actual takeaway? What do we tell people listening to this?
The takeaway is that democracy doesn't defend itself. Institutions don't preserve themselves automatically. It requires work, vigilance, the willingness to compromise without surrendering core values, the courage to reform without destroying, the wisdom to know the difference.
And if people come away from this understanding that their choices matter, that history isn't just something that happened to other people,
then maybe Cato and Caesar won't have died for nothing. Maybe we can learn from their failure instead of repeating it.
I can drink to that, metaphorically.
Metaphorically. Though Cato would approve of actual drinking.
The drunk stoic. That really should be on his tombstone.
Cato the Younger. Cold plunge mindset. Bald guy energy adjacent. Died free.
That's better than pulled out his own intestines.
Also more family friendly.
Slightly.
All right, that's our show. The Mike and Mark History Experience, where we make ancient history uncomfortably relevant.
And remind you that humans have always been a mess, but sometimes we rise above it.
Not always, but sometimes. And there's always tomorrow to try again.
Until we cross our own Rubicon.
Let's hope it doesn't come to that.
Let's hope we recognise it before we get there.
One more thing before we go.
The views expressed in this podcast are our own, based on our reading of history.
Different historians interpret these events differently, and we encourage you to explore multiple perspectives.
For more on Cato and Caesar, we recommend Plutarch's Lives, Tom Holland's excellent book Rubicon, and the recent PBS documentary Julius Caesar, The Making of a Dictator.
Thanks for listening, and remember,
history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
See you next time.
Stay vigilant out there.